is not just for today, but it's for future generations. But part of the legacy for future generations is that we leave our economies in a state that is manageable. And so the decisions we take today, for instance, around borrowing, can impact, they say government is a continuum. And the decisions of previous governments in Kenya or Nigeria do impact what present administrations do. Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Kenya have all gone to international bond markets. I think almost $5 billion worth of bond issuances just in 2024 alone. Because you can mobilize those resources quite quickly for infrastructure, for funding the budget, for instance, and other types of economic needs. But there's also the relationship African governments have with the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. There's a relationship African governments have with China. We're just on the aftermath of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation that took place recently. Ruto was there, our own president, Tinubu, was there. Africa has many friends and partners. Africa, some countries have a debt problem, they're restructuring. Africa needs to find cheap, concessionary, long-term sources of financing, ideally in local currency, but we'll park that for now, to fund development in Africa. What is the best option for finding funding for Africa now, in terms of governments being able to do what they need to do, ease in the fiscal squeeze, fund their infrastructure projects, and fund long-term projects across health, education, ports? What is the best model and partner for engagement for Africa?
Wow.
I know that's a big question.
Yeah, so maybe just giving you a quick response on this. I don't think there is one direction. It's a univariant sort of direction, right? I think it's multidimensional, meaning we need to source funding from all possible. We should be ready to source funding from all possible sources. Commercial, bilateral, bilateral from the West, bilateral from the East, bilateral from the other sources, right? And I think for me, the issue is the principle by which you decide this one as opposed to another.
Okay.
And so that, I think, is where we need to be quick.
To be clear. Those principles be?
I mean, the principle is, you need to have the cheapest for this specific project or specific outcome. As simple as that, yeah? And financially, it has to make sense.
Right.
So now, what happens is at times the pressure, gives you're under pressure, and the Minister of Finance is under pressure to fund this thing, and therefore the funding, he doesn't have, quote unquote, time to assess whether this is the only potential source or the cheapest. And the cheapest is not just interest rate, it's also currency, it's also, maturity.
Indeed.
And also a big issue is also the, how do you repay? Is it a bullet or is it sort of a gradual repayment, etc.? But the general principle of concessionality, concessional funding, obviously applies. We should try as much as possible to get concessional funding for these things. So I want to make it clear that some of these things are not, let's say,
linear in a sense.
Yeah. But I think more importantly, there are obviously political dynamics behind some of these things, right?
Of course. Yeah.
And I think we've learned our lesson in some of these things. But the specific question about China and other sources, I remember now the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, saying that really we should be friends of all and satellites of none. Yeah. And I think it is valid. Yeah. And frankly, let's be honest, Japan is the #1 investor in U.S. Treasury bills, U.S. Treasury securities.
Yes.
Yeah. And China is #2 with like 800 trillion US dollars worth of that. So it's not like they too don't depend on China or Japan or
And
other
this is
investors.
despite their diplomatic issues.
Exactly.
Yes, yes.
So I think we need to appreciate
Okay.
that decisions have to be made following that point that we are friends of all and sightless
Rights
of none.
It's a
Yeah.
very good point.